Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes for the last bit of participants to join the call, and then we'll get started. All right. I know we're still waiting on a few people to join, but let's get started and cover all of the admin stuff. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Deltek's webinar on the Canadian food regulations. My name is Joanna Chudyk, and I am a Senior Regulatory Affairs Specialist here at Deltek. And I will be hosting today's webinar and hopefully providing you with a better understanding of the food regulations in Canada. Lastly, before we begin, I wanted to mention that yes, the slides will be sent to you, so keep an eye out in your emails for the slide deck. Additionally, near the end of the webinar, you'll see a survey link in the chat box of the Teams webinar. If you could please take a couple of minutes and fill that out, we would really appreciate it, whether it's positive or negative, hopefully positive. It will help us improve any future webinars that we host. And it will also give you the opportunity to sign up for a free 15-minute call with yours truly to discuss your products and how we can help you. So I just want to start with an agenda of what I hope to cover over the next hour. So we'll start off with an introduction to Deltek and who we are and what types of services that we offer. After that, we're going to jump into sort of a quick lesson on the Canadian food regulations, and we'll learn about the different legislations that exist, what regulatory authorities enforce those legislations. Then we'll discuss the broad categories of food that exist in Canada, and we'll finish it off with the general food labeling requirements, just to give you sort of an overview of what's required on a Canadian food label. And it will help us out when we go to the next section, which is the frequently asked questions portion. So this is going to be a compilation of questions that we commonly receive from clients and also questions that you had asked through registration for this webinar. We'll finish off with the upcoming regulatory changes. We'll summarize what's to come and their deadlines, and then we'll also cover a few changes that have been discussed, but there's no official deadline on those yet. And then we'll have just a resource page for you to reference. I will be mentioning a lot of links to web pages that you may find helpful. So please visit that page if you're interested in learning more about any of the topics I discuss. And of course, we'll finish off with just our contact information should you wish to get into contact with us. So, who is Deltek? So, as I mentioned, I'm a regulatory affairs specialist here at Deltek, and I specialize in foods DINs, so those are your drug products, hard surface disinfectants, over the counters, and natural health products. But we also provide services in a variety of other areas as well. So we have a product safety team, and they'll help you with SDS authoring, triple CR, and of course the VOC regulations, which are new and going to be implemented very soon. So if you need assistance with that, we're able to help. And we also have an on-site laboratory. So if you're looking for claim support testing, hazard classification, ISO testing, we also provide services in those areas. And of course, regulatory affairs, which is the team I'm a part of. We specialize in a very broad range of products. So that includes over the counters, cosmetics, pesticides, and we also are available to assist with NSNs. So let's jump right into the nitty-gritty of today's presentation. So there are two main acts and legislations that federally regulate food in Canada. There's the Safe Food for Canadians Act and Regulations and the Food and Drugs Act and Regulations. So the Safe Food for Canadians Act, that's enforced by the CFIA, or the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And this is a very recent regulation that came into place only back in 2019. And the goal of these regulations were to help modernize our old regulations and promote innovation in food businesses. So we had 14 sets of regulations previously that covered a variety of different food commodities, such as dairy products, eggs, honey, so any type of food commodity. And now it's all under one set. So you don't have to go looking at 14 different sets of regulations. It's now all been consolidated, which is great. And this act and regulations are geared towards foods that are imported into Canada and exported elsewhere. They also cover food transported between provinces and territories. And you can find information related to food representation, labeling, composition, grading, food packaging. So that includes your net quantity information, the country of origin, container size restrictions that may exist for your food product. So that's what you can find in this act and regulations. The second act in place is the Food and Drugs Regulations. And these cover foods and drugs, but we're going to focus on the food portion today. And this is where you'll find information on the nutrition facts table, claims, and what's acceptable to put on your label, food allergens, so what the priority food allergens are in Canada and what type of labeling requirements there are for each one, expiration date requirements. So all of that information is all encompassed in the Food and Drugs Act. So I know it can be a little intimidating to have two different acts and regulations to reference when you're trying to bring your product into Canada compliantly. But once you familiarize yourself with these regulations and understand where to go for what type of information, then it will become a lot more clear. And I just wanted to add that this webinar is going to focus only on the federal regulations, but there are also provincial regulations that might apply to your food product. And these will typically take precedent over the federal regulations. So it's super important that if you're bringing your product across provincial or territorial borders, that you are aware of the provincial regulations that exist. So next, let's jump into the different food categories. Now, this doesn't cover all of the different food categories that exist in Canada. I just wanted to focus on the ones that will be related to the frequently asked questions portion of this presentation. And we'll start off with standardized foods. So standardized foods are those with specific composition requirements in order to be called a certain common name. So an example I like to use for this type of food product is baking powder. And this is a screenshot taken directly from the regulations. And you can see there are a number of requirements listed here for baking powder in order for you to use the common name baking powder. And this also applies if you're using this as an ingredient in another product. So for example, you have a package of muffins that you're selling and you're listing one of the ingredients as baking powder. You need to make sure that the baking powder you're using in your product also complies with the regulations. The next food category we're going to discuss are fortified foods, which include foods that either voluntarily can be fortified or are required to be fortified with nutrients such as vitamins, minerals, amino acids. And these are separate from supplemented foods, which we're going to get into next. But an example is another screenshot here from the regulations is for milk. So in order to sell a milk product in Canada, you must ensure you contain 2 micrograms of vitamin D per 100 milliliters of product. So here's just an example of one of the required fortifications. And it's always important that when you're bringing a milk product into Canada that you're aware of the standardizations that exist, or if you're bringing another food that's required to be fortified in Canada as well. So next we'll jump to supplemented foods, which I know is a very hot topic. These regulations were just introduced last year, and they created a new division, Division 29, and that's where you'll find all of the information you need on supplemented foods and their requirements. So for those of you that are less familiar with this food category, a little bit of history. So historically, we require to submit something called a temporary marketing authorization application to the Food Directorate in order to sell supplemented foods. And this was an application that outlined the formula of your product. You provided your labels for review, and Food Directorate would come back and issue you a temporary marketing authorization letter, or a TMAL, if they approved the product for sale in Canada. And this letter came with rules that you needed to abide by if you wanted to sell your product in Canada. And most of these rules were to collect data from your consumers. So, who's consuming your product? Are they reading the directions for use? Are they reading the cautionary statements? So, all of this data was collected and analyzed by the Food Directorate. And that is what was taken to create the supplemented food regulations. So now you can bring your supplemented food into Canada without a TMA or pre-approval, but you need to make sure that your product fully complies with Division 29 in the regulations. We'll go into a lot more detail on supplemented foods in the FAQ section of this webinar, but that's just sort of an intro to supplemented foods. So the next category are foods for special dietary use. So similar to standardized foods, they have strict compositional requirements. And these include meal replacements, nutritional supplements, formulated liquid diets, and it's important that they meet the nutrition requirements outlined in Division 24 of the regulations. We have heard that Food Directorate is currently updating these regulations because they're very outdated at this point. I think it's been a few decades since they've been updated. So there are changes coming. We just don't know when or what these changes will encompass. So the next category I wanted to mention was food additives. So these are different than regular food ingredients because they have a technical effect on your food product. So this includes your coloring agents, sweeteners, preservatives, anti-caking agents, and you can find all of the acceptable food additives in Canada on their website, and the list is called Lists of Permitted Food Additives. And when you visit that webpage, you'll notice that it's categorized based on the different food additive functions. And there's a table outlining what ingredients are acceptable, at what level, and in what food products they're acceptable for use. So it's not only important that all of your individual ingredients are acceptable in Canada, but your food additives are also regulated. So it's important to check and make sure that the food additives you're adding into your product are acceptable in that product type. And lastly, novel foods. So these are products that are known to not have a history of safe use or a HOSU, and they typically require some kind of feedback from the Food Directorate in order to sell them compliantly in Canada. So it's important to remember that just because a food ingredient is acceptable in the US or Europe doesn't necessarily mean it's acceptable for sale in Canada. So if you ever suspect a food is novel, then there are a number of steps that you'll need to take before selling your product in Canada. And we'll go into a bit further detail of that in the FAQ section as well. And on this slide, we have the general food labeling requirements in Canada. So this does not encompass all of the requirements, but just the basic ones, so you have a basic understanding of what is needed on a Canadian food label. So the first part of the label we're going to look at is the principal display panel, or the PDP. And on this surface, you're required to include the common name. So this is the name at which your food is commonly referred to as. And there are certain font size requirements as well, depending on the area of the principal display surface. And this calculation can be found on the CFIA labeling guidance. The next required portion is the bilingual labeling. So that's the French and English translation on the label. So you can see here in the image, we have the English and the French underneath. And I wanted to add that if you're selling your product in Quebec, there are even more stringent requirements for French translations. For example, you need to make sure it's of equal prominence to the English translation. So that's something to keep in mind if you are selling your product in Quebec. And lastly, we have the net quantity. And this needs to be displayed in metric units. So US units are optional, but you are required to have the metric units. So for products that are solids, that's grams or kilograms. And for liquids, that's milliliters or liters. So for this product, it's a pancake and waffle mix. So that's a solid, and it should be listed in grams. So we're going to move on now to the back panel. And this is where you'll find information such as the list of ingredients. So it's important that when you're listing the ingredients, you're complying with any sort of formatting requirements, so of size and text, font type, color, and that the ingredients are listed in descending order, and make sure that your sugars are being grouped and that any food allergens are being called out on the label as well through your contains or may contain statements. The next requirement is the principal place of business address and the contact information. So this is required in case a consumer has a question about your product and they want to contact you. And the last requirement, and probably the most important, is the nutrition facts table. So this is required on most food labels. There are some exemptions, and I believe the deadline for the new nutrition facts table passed in December 2022. So the new nutrition facts table format is a little bit different. And I also wanted to bring your attention to the serving size information that's listed here. So Food Directorate worked on making the serving size more consistent across products of the same type, just so consumers can more easily determine whether easily compare two products to each other and look at the nutritional content. So sugar content, the sodium content, because if you've noticed going to the grocery store in the past, you'd have two cereal products. One of them would be listed at 1 cup of serving size, another one would be 1/4 cup, which can make it really difficult, and you have to do those calculations in your head to determine which one actually has lower sugar content. So in order to make this more consistent across food categories, the serving size comes from reference amounts. So there's a table of reference amounts, and for each product category, there is amount that Food Directorate deems as the amount that can be reasonably consumed in one sitting. And that is your serving size. So that's a new requirement for the nutrition facts table. And it's super important that you're not just coming up with whatever serving size you would like to put on your product, that it is compliant with the reference amount table. So now we're going to jump into the frequently asked questions portion of our webinar. And we're going to start off the section with food labeling. So by far, the most frequently asked question we receive from clients is, can I bring my US food label into Canada? So, no, you can't. And there are a number of reasons why, but mainly it's just the regulations are completely different in the US and Canada. And we'll visualize these differences on the next couple of slides. But mainly, you're looking at the language requirements. So, as I mentioned on the previous slide, we need to make sure that Canadian food labels are bilingual. So, that's French and English. The nutrition facts tables also look very different and have different requirements. And the restrictions on health and nutrient content claims you can make on a food product in Canada also vary significantly from the US. So here's an example of a US and Canadian label. So right off the bat, you can see that the Canadian front panel has the French and English translations. And of course, the net contents are in metric units, whereas in the US, you have them in the US units, ounces. So that's just one of the differences between these two countries. And then I also wanted to show you the two different types of nutrition facts tables and how much they differ. So even just looking at these two nutrition facts tables, you can already see that there are a number of formatting differences. And you can also see that the serving size is different. So like I mentioned on the previous slide, we need to make sure our serving sizes are according to the table of reference amounts. So here I have a screenshot taken from the table of reference amounts, and this is a chip product. So you can see it would qualify under this category, and the reference amount is 50 grams. But you can also list the number of chips closest in weight to the 50 grams as well, which is what they did. And that is the amount that should appear on the nutrition facts table. Whereas in the US, you can see that their serving size is about 11 chips, which is significantly lower than the one listed on the Canadian front panel. Another thing we can call out is the ingredient listing. So you can notice a lot of formatting differences here. In Canada, you can't have the ingredients listed all in caps lock like this. They need to appear with just the first letter of the word being capital and then the rest lowercase. So you can see that with all of these changes, it would make it impossible to bring your US food label into Canada compliantly. So, of course, there's always ways that clients look to work around these differences and how they can have a cost-efficient alternative to having a completely separate Canadian food label. And some of the ideas that our clients come to us with is having one label, but on the front panel, you have your Canadian compliant label, and on the back, you have the US compliant label. And that would avoid having to have two separate labels for each country. However, this is not actually acceptable in Canada. The double-sided labels, because you're including information from the US on there and the required statements for the US, CFIA doesn't like to see that information. They like to see that the food product label has language and information that's specific to the Canadian regulatory requirements. Another alternative some clients come to us with is a sticker label. So that's a sticker you take and you place it over top of any sort of other label, and that sticker has the Canadian compliant information. We also don't recommend that this be used as your final label either. It can be used as a temporary solution if you're in the process of transitioning to a Canadian compliant label, but it should by no means be your final product label. So the next question we have is, do I require nutritional laboratory testing on my food product to determine the nutrition values to declare on my nutrition facts table? So currently, no, there are no requirements that state you need to have your product analyzed by a laboratory to determine the exact nutritional information of your product. So you can choose either or. There are, of course, pros and cons to both methods. So laboratory analysis is, of course, going to be more reliable because you're having your actual product tested. So this might be beneficial for those types of products such as Division 24, so those for special dietary use, because they have those strict compositional requirements. It would maybe be beneficial to have your product undergo some kind of laboratory analysis to ensure that the information you're providing is reliable. However, it is an expensive method, so a lot of clients just opt for those database calculations. So there are a number of softwares available, and you just input all of the ingredients in your product and it spits out the nutrition facts table. This can be less accurate, so do use it with caution because it does not account for any sort of processing losses or seasonal variations that can exist with ingredients. So use either at your own risk, and you will be liable if your nutrition facts table isn't accurate. So that's just something to keep in mind, but a lot of companies do just use the database calculations because they're much easier and cheaper. When is the best before date or expiration date required for my product? So in order to answer this question, we need to understand what the difference is between these two dates. So expiration dates are those after which the manufacturer does not recommend that the product be consumed. So this is only required for Division 24 and Division 25 products. And that's because they have those strict compositional requirements. So you want to make sure that by the end of the shelf life, your product is still meeting those label claims. The best before date, on the other hand, is more of a quality date. So when is the freshness and taste the best for your product? And this is only required for foods with a shelf life of less than 90 days. And although it's not required for any other products to have it, we do recommend that clients include that date on the label anyway, just because it's something consumers like to see. Whenever you're purchasing a product, you like to know how long it's going to last in your cupboard. What type of restrictions exist for making claims on food? So there are a lot of restrictions that come with any type of information you're putting on your food label in Canada. You can bet that any statement you wish to put on your label, there is likely a requirement or regulation related to that. So it's super important to make sure that your claims are accurate and not misleading to the consumer. So the types of claims that you're allowed to put on a food product label include disease risk reduction claims, which are illustrated in the example I have here on the slide. So the whole wheat cereal, we have the heart with the oat fiber helps lower cholesterol claim. So that would be considered a disease risk reduction claim. And these are only acceptable under certain conditions of use. So you need to make sure to reference the CFIA guidance and the regulations to determine whether you have enough of that ingredient in order to support the claim. A couple of other examples are calcium and vitamin C help build strong bones and reduce the risk of osteoporosis. Or for gums and hard candies, you can see claims such as won't cause cavities. For nutrient content claims, these are based on how much of a nutrient is in your product. And depending on what type of terminology you want to use, there are different restrictions and requirements. So here we have an example on the slide of the crackers that list low sodium. So you need to make sure you comply with the restrictions associated with using the statement low sodium. For example, we also have protein. So your product can say source of protein and high in protein, but be aware that these two different terms do mean something different. So you need to make sure you're meeting the threshold in order to utilize the term high in protein. Another example is reduced fat or low fat. These terms also both mean something different. So it's super important that any sort of wording and terminology you wish to use on your label is compliant with the regulations. And the last type of claim that's acceptable on foods are nutrient function claims. So the example I have here is vitamin E is a dietary antioxidant. So if you have any beneficial nutrients in your product that you want to call out, there are restrictions associated with these claims as well, but as long as you meet those conditions, you can make those types of claims on your label. There are, of course, claims that are never permitted. So those include medicated claims. These are claims that your product has medicinal properties or has a medicinal ingredient in there that can treat or prevent a disease. So these types of claims are not acceptable on foods. Laxative claims, so that's the relief of constipation, and tonic claims. And of course, there is an exemption here for tonic water. That is an acceptable claim to make for your product. Any claims that are outlined in the Food and Drug Regulations, we recommend you file a claim submission to Health Canada. It's not required that you have a pre-approval to use a specific claim that's outside of the scope of the regulations on your label, although we highly encourage you do, just in case CFIA comes with any questions and to avoid any sort of complications down the line. But if you have the data on hand to support the claims and you want to use that claim, as long as it doesn't go against anything written in the regulations and the restrictions, you are able to put that on your label. What's the difference between a may contain versus a contains allergy statement? So I like to use an example for this. So may contain is related to any type of cross-contamination that might occur, and contains is if you're intentionally adding an ingredient that's a priority allergen into your product. So the example I like to use is you have a cereal product that's manufactured in the same facility as ice cream, and there's risk of cross-contamination present. So on the cereal product, you would have to put may contains milk. And because you're not intentionally adding any sort of milk ingredients into the product, then you wouldn't need the contains statement. The contain statement would be required if you're actually adding a milk ingredient into the cereal product. So yogurt powder or milk powder, you would need to include a contain statement because you are intentionally adding that ingredient into the formula. So the last question for this section is, what regulatory responsibilities exist for grocery retailers in terms of food labeling? So most clients assume that the onus is entirely on importers and manufacturers of food products to make sure that food and food labels and any advertising material is compliant. However, that doesn't mean that retailers don't also share an accountability. They're also still liable if they sell a product on their shelves that do not have compliant labeling or posting any sort of advertising or marketing material that is not compliant. So the next portion is going to focus on questions related to novel foods. So you may ask, what is a novel food? So I briefly touched on this at the beginning of the presentation, but to reiterate, a novel food can fall into any of these categories. So no history of safe use, the product is produced using novel processes, or the ingredient has been genetically modified. So it's important to remember, and I already mentioned this, that if an ingredient is acceptable in a different country, it doesn't necessarily mean it's acceptable in Canada. So anytime you're bringing a food product into Canada, it's super important to review every single ingredient you have in your formula and make sure that they are all acceptable food ingredients in Canada. So there are a number of resources you can visit if you're trying to determine if your ingredient is novel. The first of which is the Canadian Nutrient File, or CNF. And this is a database of ingredients that are recognized as foods in Canada. So you can always search that database to determine whether or not your ingredient would be considered a food ingredient. There's also the list of permitted food additives that I've also mentioned. So if your ingredient exhibits a technical function on the product, you need to make sure that it's an acceptable food additive in Canada. And there's also the completed safety assessments of novel foods list that is on the Health Canada website. And this was implemented just a few years ago, but anytime someone comes to the food directorate and asks for a novel food determination or any type of feedback on their suspected novel food ingredient, the food directorate will come back and state whether the ingredient is novel or non-novel. And this is publicly available information, which is great. So you can reference that list to see whether your specific ingredient has already been evaluated. If my ingredient isn't present in the CNF, does that mean it is novel? So I mentioned this on the previous slide. The CNF is a database, and I have a screenshot here on the slide as well. And the answer is no, that just because an ingredient isn't in the CNF does not mean it is necessarily novel. And the reason behind this is that the CNF has not actually been updated since 2015. They aim to have it updated every 2 to 3 years, but they are very long overdue for an update. So we're hoping to expect one within the next 1 to 2 years. So you'll notice when looking through this database that there are some ingredients that are foods, but you cannot find it on the database. So dragon fruit and yuzu, these are all ingredients we've seen in a number of food products, and even dragon fruit, the fruit itself, you can buy on store shelves. So those are not considered novel foods, even though they're not present in the CNF. And if you ever come across an ingredient that you believe should be in the CNF, you can always contact their team and request that it be added. But if the CNF comes back to you and says, I think you need to get this ingredient evaluated by the food directorate since we don't think it's a common food ingredient, what are your next steps? So the first step would be to submit a novelty determination ingredient form, or an NDIF. And this is basically a document that outlines exactly what your ingredient is. So the manufacturing information, what type of components or sub-ingredients are present in the product, and a history of safe use if it exists in a different country. So all of this information is provided to the food directorate, and they will come back to you stating whether they think your ingredient is novel or not novel. So if it's not novel, you'll be issued a letter of non-novelty that you should keep on file. And this is confirming that your product itself is not novel. And there are sometimes some conditions of use as well, so that this ingredient can only be used in certain product types. So it's super important to stay compliant with whatever is issued in that letter. But if they come back and say your product is considered novel, then there are a number of steps you can take depending on what the ingredient is. That's a novel food submission, a food additive submission. If you think the ingredient is a food additive, the novel food safety assessment and environmental assessment. And all of these pathways are not for the weak of heart, I should say. They are very big submissions to make. They take a lot of time. So you can expect at least a year or two for any sort of approval on this novel food. And it's a very in-depth analysis of what your ingredient actually is. So it's very comparable to a GRAS in the US. So you're looking at the dietary exposure, the toxicological information, any type of other information, the breakdown of the ingredient. So all of this information is basically to prove the safety of this food ingredient for just the general consumption of the Canadian population. So it is definitely burdensome. So what we experience is most clients opt to just proceed with a reformulation to remove this novel ingredient from their formula. So the next portion is going to focus on questions related to food fortification and supplemented foods. So I have a supplemented food that does not meet the regulations. Can I submit a temporary marketing authorization, TMA? So I briefly mentioned this at the beginning of the webinar, but the TMA process is no longer open for supplemented foods. If you're bringing a supplemented food product into Canada, you need to make sure it fully complies with Division 29. There are still TMA applications being accepted for foods under Division 24. So those are special dietary use, meal replacements, nutritional supplements, but you cannot submit these applications any longer for supplemented foods. There is a transition period for transitioning your product, but that is only for a specific subset of products. So these are companies that held a valid temporary marketing authorization letter at the time that the new regulations were published. They are given until December 31st, 2025 in order to fully bring their product into compliance with the new regulation. But if you don't qualify for this transition period, then if you're bringing your supplemented food product into Canada, they need to fully comply with those regulations. So how do I know if I qualify for the transition period? There is actually a list that's published on the Health Canada website, and it includes products that had temporary marketing authorization letters that were still valid at the time the regulations came into place. And if you're ever unsure if your product qualifies, you can check these published lists. And they'll also include those that were issued an exemption or a notice letter to qualify for the transition period as well. What's the difference between a supplemental ingredient and a regular food ingredient? So, a supplemental ingredient is assumed to provide some kind of additional nutritional value to the product through an added vitamin, mineral, amino acid, or any type of other ingredient that you'll find in the list of supplemental ingredients. A regular food ingredient would be something that already has those added vitamins and minerals that exist in the product itself. So for example, you're adding an apple into your formula because it has a bunch of nutrients and vitamins. That would be a regular food ingredient. However, if you're adding just the specific isolates of vitamins and minerals into your formula, that would be a supplemental ingredient. And the list of supplemental ingredients is also expanding. You can submit a request to add any other supplemental ingredients you wish, and the food directorate is accepting those submissions as well. So just an example of a situation where a product may also be a food additive, even though it's on the supplemental ingredient list. So the example I like to use is magnesium and magnesium stearate. So at the top here of the slide, you can see a screenshot taken directly from the list of permitted food additives, and magnesium stearate is allowed to be used in these specific product categories and at these specific restriction on the amount that can be used. But magnesium stearate can also be considered a source of magnesium. So magnesium is an acceptable supplemental ingredient, and they have restrictions on how much you can use. And there are some cautionary statements that can be associated with the ingredient. However, if you can prove that your ingredient is not meant to exhibit any sort of supplemental ingredient functions and instead is just used for its technical effects, then you can just abide by the food additive requirements that exist. But it's important to note that if you are listing the ingredient as a food additive and not a supplemental ingredient, you cannot make any claims related to the magnesium content for that ingredient. Whereas if you list it as a supplemental ingredient, then you can use those types of magnesium content claims as well. There have been several recalls of caffeinated energy drinks in the recent news. How can compliance issues like this be avoided? So, I'm sure a lot of you have seen the articles that have been published of a lot of CEDs being recalled, and they're being recalled for a number of reasons. But for the most part, it's because of inaccurate caffeine content declaration. So, the amount of caffeine that's in the product doesn't match the label claim, or it doesn't comply with the restrictions in the regulations. And also, the labeling requirements are not being met for supplemented foods. So on this slide, I have two screenshots of the different labeling requirements that are associated with supplemented foods. We have the supplemented food facts table, which is different than the nutrition facts table. You can see that the title is different. It lists supplemented food facts. And of course, we have a section here where you can declare what your product is supplemented with. The second requirement is the supplemented food caution identifier that also must appear on the front panel of your product. And of course, you need to make sure that any sort of cautionary statements for your product are present on the label as well. So as long as you're fully compliant with the established supplemented food regulations, you shouldn't be worried about having your product recalled. A comment period relating to food marketing directed primarily to children was launched in June 2023. Will these restrictions apply to supplemented foods? So because supplemented foods are covered under the Food and Drug Regulations, then yes, the restrictions that will apply to foods directed at children will apply to supplemented foods. So there's not a lot of information yet about what these restrictions are going to be, but we know it's going to apply to products that contain added sodium, sugars, and saturated fats. And if you meet that threshold requirement and it's intended for a child under the age of 13 years old, then those restrictions for advertising material will apply to your product. But as I mentioned, nothing's in place yet, and we're expecting a draft regulatory framework to be open for consultation in 2024. And if you're signed up for Deltek's newsletter emails, you will be notified as soon as those regulations are published. So the last portion of the frequently asked questions section is related to the food NHP interface. So what is the food NHP interface? I consider this as sort of the blurry line between food and NHP that can exist for some products. And it might be up to the manufacturer of the product to decide which route they want to market their product as. There are a number of factors that come to reviewing a formula and deciding whether it can fall into the food category or NHP category, which is a natural health product. And those include the representation of the product, the way it's presented. Is it for hydration or is it to fulfill hunger? Those are more food-like claims to have on your label. And for NHPs, it would be calling out a medicinal ingredient or the product itself has medicinal properties. We can also look at the format. So NHPs are considered drugs. So they have the more typical drug formats that exist. So capsules, tablets, powders, whereas foods you see in just the typical food formats, such as a shake, a soup, a drink. So depending on those two factors, that can influence whether your product is an NHP or a food. But we also look at the public perception. So when a consumer sees your product on the shelves, What do they think it is? Do they think it's a food product or do they think it's an NHP? So it's more than just the formula that we look at. There's a lot of other important factors that are important before considering your food is a food or an NHP. And it's super important that you have a clear established path that you're going down because both natural health products and foods have very significantly different requirements when it comes to labeling and manufacturing. What's the difference between a natural health product and a supplemented food? So, as I mentioned, we look at the formula, the format, and in this case, we're also looking at the fortification. So, supplemented foods can only include ingredients that are acceptable in general food products and are on the list of permitted supplemental ingredients. It's also important that the food product itself is a conventional food format. So you would never see a food product in a capsule or a tablet form. That's more drug-like. So you're seeing more of the traditional conventional food formats, which are bars, shakes, those types of formats. Whereas NHPs, you need to make sure that the formula itself only includes ingredients that are present in the non-prescription and natural health product ingredient database, or the NNHPID, which is a mouthful. But this is a database that includes all of the acceptable ingredients for natural health products in Canada. They can also be a wide variety of formats. So these are your traditional drug-like formats, so capsules, tablets, powders, liquids. And one other important factor to consider is the different fortification levels and acceptable levels of those nutrients in both of these categories. So the amount of a nutrient that's acceptable in NHPs versus a supplemented food differs significantly. So it's super important you're referencing the correct regulation depending on which food category you're marketing your product as. What other considerations need to be made before deciding to market your product as a food or an NHP? So, as I mentioned already, the regulations that exist for natural health products and food products differ significantly. So, any labeling requirements are different. So, for an NHP, you'll require an NPN number, which requires pre approval from Health Canada and is an application that you submit to get that NPN number and for your NHP product to be approved in Canada. In foods, you don't have that pre-approval process, but you do require a nutrition facts table. Foods also have more restrictions on the types of claims they can be made, whereas NHPs, you can get a lot more creative with your claims for those types of products. The marketing material and any other material you're posting on your website, for example, also need to be compliant with the applicable regulation. The manufacturing requirements also differ significantly between natural health products and food products. So, manufacturing requirements for foods include HACCP where required, whereas for NHPs, you need to have a valid site license in Canada for manufacturing any type of natural health product. So typically what we tell clients is if you're looking to market your product with some fancy elaborate claims, you should go the NHP route. There is the pre-approval process that I already mentioned. Depending on your class of product, it can take 60 to 210 days. And if you're looking just to get your product to market as fast as possible, that would be the food pathway, just because there's no sort of pre-approval process that exists for foods in Canada. So that completes our FAQ portion of the webinar. And I just wanted to issue another reminder, keep a look out in the chat box for the survey link. Your feedback is super appreciated and it gives you the opportunity to share any other webinar topics you'd like to attend and opt into a free call with me to discuss your products and how Deltec is able to assist. So here on this slide, I just have illustrated the different regulatory changes that are coming in Canada over the next coming months and years. So the supplemented food regulations, which is number one, we've already discussed that in depth, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But the second change that's coming that we didn't get an opportunity to discuss is the front of package nutrition labeling. And I have a little screenshot of what this image looks like. And this symbol should appear on your product's primary display panel if you meet the specific thresholds that exist for sodium, sugars, and saturated fats. And the intent of this symbol on your product is to be more transparent with consumers when they're looking at your product on the shelves. They can easily identify those products that may be less healthy for them to consume. And that deadline is coming December 31st, 2025. The next change that's coming is the changes to the sodium and potassium daily value changes. So because sodium appears in the nutrition facts table, a lot of the nutrition facts tables will need to be changed. So make sure that you're implementing those changes by the implementation deadline. And of course, sodium is also related to the front of pack nutrition labeling as well, because you're calculating the thresholds for the sodium content based on the daily value. And because the sodium daily value is changing, that's going to change whether you're required to hold the front of package nutrition symbol. So it's super important to stay on top of that and make sure that you review your product to determine if you qualify for the front of pack symbol. And number 4 change, the reference amount changes that exist. These also apply to these also will influence the changes for the sodium potassium daily value changes and front of pack nutrition labeling, because your reference amounts are your serving sizes, if you recall way back in the beginning of the presentation. So the way you're calculating your daily values will be affected as well. So these 3 changes really impact one another. So it's super important that you look at all of them and meet that deadline for implementation for December 31st, 2025. Other changes that have been mentioned, but there's no sort of deadline yet, are food sold through e-commerce. So there was a comment period that was open for foods that are sold online. During the pandemic, a lot of people opted to order their groceries online. And if you've ever ordered your groceries through one of the available apps, you'll notice that the type of information you can see for each product is very lacking. Sometimes you can't even see the picture of the product. There's no ingredient list. You can't look at nutrition facts tables either. So you're stuck kind of Googling that type of information if you have any sort of dietary restrictions or concerns. So there are guidances coming in order to make this a more consumer-friendly experience. There are also a couple of other changes coming to the analysis of foods, so related to microbiological criteria and food additives, and the calculation for protein quality in foods is also changing. And the last change coming is the restrictions to food advertising directed at children, which I also discussed briefly during the FAQ portion. So here we have the list of resources that I promised. So these are a number of links that I referenced throughout my presentation. So if you have any questions or want to learn more about a specific topic, these resources are available to you. And of course, if you wish to contact us, please let me know if you have any questions on today's webinar. And again, make sure to fill out that survey as well. We really value your feedback. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining today's webinar. I hope you learned a lot, and I hope to hear from all of you soon. So have a great rest of your afternoon.